Now I want to talk about power. What do we mean by the most powerful locomotive? And it's important you understand the difference between power and tractive effort here. So, the two locomotives you can see now in the foreground, we've got the Eleniar A2 again, Peppercorn A2. In the background, we've got the British Standard 9F 210, designed by Robert Riddles. It's often described as the most powerful locomotive in Britain. That's not true, actually, but we'll come back to why that isn't in a minute. What is power? Well, power can be defined in two ways, or several ways actually, by a scientist. You could say it's the amount of energy used per second. So a 100-watt light bulb uses 100 joules of energy per second. You could say it's the rate at which useful work is done. So that is basically how much force is being applied by a locomotive multiplied by how fast the locomotive is going. And that's another way of thinking of power. In terms of a steam engine, we can think of power, though, really in two ways. One is, what's the power going into the engine from its fuel, from its coal? If you burn more coal per second, you're going to generate more energy per second. If your engine is particularly efficient, it's going to boil more water per second. That's going to generate more steam per second. That means each time you open the valves into your cylinder and your cylinder gets full of steam, it's going to push back the piston, and that's going to drive the driving wheels round. The more powerful the engine, the more steam it can produce. That means when the next valve in the next cylinder opens, the pressure in the boiler is still very high, so it can provide the same pressure for the next cylinder, and so on. If you fitted a very small boilered locomotive with a small firebox that is unable to heat much water, if you fitted that to a chassis that had very big cylinders, right, you fill the first cylinder with steam, it pushes off, and it gives quite a high tractive effort maybe. But as soon as that cylinder exhausts its steam and that you want to fill the next cylinder with steam, your pressure in your boiler will decrease because you're not burning much coal because you've got a small firebox, and you're not boiling much water because you've got less heating area for the heat from the fumes, if you like, the exhaust from the fire has got less metal to come into contact with to transfer its heat to the water. So the biggest, most powerful engines are the ones that, all other things being equal, well lubricated, not leaking, other things in the design being equal, are the ones that boil water quickest. And to boil water quickest, you need a big boiler with lots of metal tubes in it, where the heating tubes where the exhaust gases from the fire go through. The more surface area you've got there, and the bigger the fire you've got burning, so you've got more coal burning, the more you can boil water to create steam. And that basically is what makes a steam engine more powerful. People often say, oh yeah, the 9F, that's the highest power rating on British Railways. However, look at these two locomotives. Okay, the 9F is slightly behind the A2, but the A2 has got a slightly bigger boiler, and actually it's got a bigger firebox too. The grate of the A2 firebox is 50 square feet, whereas the grate of the 9F firebox is only about 40 square feet. Now, the 9F is a more modern design, only a couple of years more modern than the 4 or 5 years more modern than the A2. But the 9F was built and designed with efficiency in mind, and it probably does, with its 40-foot square firebox, probably generate a little bit more heat than you might expect, considering it's a smaller firebox than the Peppercorn A2. However, the Peppercorn A2 also has a larger surface area of heating tubes to raise steam. So it is probably a more powerful locomotive. Okay, make sure you understand that the most powerful locomotives are the one that raise steam more quickly. and assuming all other things are equal, they will generate more power, because that's just a basic law of science. Power is energy per second. What you put in, you get out. You can't destroy energy. So unless there's lots of leaks and the locomotive is designed very inefficiently, so that a lot of the power is lost, a lot of heat is lost from the locomotive, rather than staying in the steam, maintaining it as a gas. So there we go. So why is the 9F a class 9 in power and the A2 is a class 8 passenger? 8P as opposed to 9F. And what's the difference? Well, the power classification that the British Railways used was, I believe, introduced by the LMS originally. A lot of their locomotives were given names based on their power. So the most famous probably is the Black 5. Its power rating was 5. 5F, 5 for freight, and 5P, 5 for passenger. Equally famous probably, or almost as famous, the Stania 8F, their heavy freight locomotive. I think, I could be wrong, but it had a very similar size boiler and firebox than the 5F. The 5, well, mixed traffic, the class 5. But the class 5 had bigger wheels. Therefore, bigger wheels means with the same boiler raising the same amount of steam, you get a faster locomotive with the bigger wheels, but you get less tractive effort. Now, I could be wrong. I'm not an expert on LMS locomotives at all. But that's my suggestion. Anyway, here we go. We've got the 9F and we've got the A2 again. So with the 9F, it's probably less powerful because it's got a smaller heating area and a smaller firebox, but it still has a very high tractive effort, about 39,000 pounds, I believe. The A2 is actually 40,000 pounds. The 9F was an interesting character. No, I'll come back to that. The power rating then is based on the tractive effort that the locomotives produce at a certain speed, because power is force, tractive effort, multiplied by speed. So with passenger locomotives, because they were designed to go fast, they rated their power as their tractive effort at 50 miles per hour, whereas the freight locomotives were rated on their tractive effort at 25 miles an hour. So a 9F producing more tractive effort than an 8P, but only at 25 miles an hour, whereas the 8P was producing its tractive effort at 50 miles an hour. And let's face it, with most freight locomotives, you don't need them to get somewhere quickly. The coal train this 9F is about to pull, it doesn't need to get to the power station very quickly, because the power station has a stockpile of coal. So long as trains run around the clock, day in, day out, delivering the coal to the power station, it can keep running. Whereas passengers on a passenger train, they want to get there quickly. They want to get to their destination quickly. And time would have been wasted sitting on a train before the days of Wi-Fi and all that stuff. So they wanted to get from A to B as quickly as possible. It's a different demand. So the 9F, yes, it's very powerful because it's got a good high tractive effort at 25 miles an hour, whereas the A2, and even more so the A1s, they are an 8P because they've got a decent amount of power at double the speed, 50 miles an hour. Well, let's get these guys going again. So there you have it. The most powerful locomotives are the ones that can raise the most steam most quickly. They're the ones that can generate the highest pressure of steam as quickly as possible. And they do that by burning more coal. And to burn more coal more efficiently, you need a fairly big firebox. Now, my original question was the Eleanor Garrett, the U1, the most powerful locomotive ever to run on British railways? Well, it certainly had a very big firebox. The Great was something like 56 square foot. The A1 and A2s 50 foot. The 9F 40 foot. I can't remember, I think that the Mikados, the P2s, like Prince of Wales, which is currently being built by the A1 Trust, I think they also had a 50-foot firebox. Great. So they're probably among the most powerful. Now, was the U1 more powerful? It had a bigger firebox. That doesn't mean to say it burnt more coal per second. For a start with a firebox, you've got to feed that firebox. You've got the limiting factor of the fireman stoking it with coal continuously and also spreading that coal suitably around the firebox, great, so that you're not going to be having, well, not enough oxygen getting to the coal, some of the coal not burning. Doesn't matter how big your grate is if half the coal isn't getting a sufficient oxygen to burn. So I suspect with the case of the U1, it might not have been the most powerful locomotive in Britain, especially as it was a one-off. It wasn't developed. If you think about the most powerful passenger locomotives and the 9F as the most powerful freight locomotives, they were all evolution of previous models. So, for example, probably the most powerful locomotive in Britain is one of the Stanier Duchesses. I think they probably have produced the greatest feats of locomotive haulage, going up the slopes, the inclines and the long inclines of the West Coast Main Line. And there are talk of some of them generating between 3,000 and 3,500 horsepower of power. So I suspect they are the most powerful locomotives in Britain. But they, of course, were evolved from the Princess class, Stanier's first attempt at a big Pacific locomotive. Similarly, Peppercorn's A1 and A2, they evolved from the Gresley Pacifics and all the work he'd done. So it seems unlikely that a one-off locomotive built in 1925, the U1, the Garrett, was the most powerful locomotive in Britain. I suspect, I haven't found information about its power anywhere, but I suspect it probably didn't raise steam as efficiently as these later models did. It was, like I say, it was a one-off, and almost all one-off locomotives, almost all new designs have teething problems, have faults in them that reduce their effectiveness. And so I suspect that might well be the case with the U1. Yeah, I can't be sure, but I have read somewhere, I think it was in a book by O.S. Nock about the Stanier Pacifics, that it was in fact the Duchesses that are probably the most powerful steam locomotive ever to run in Britain. What can you say about the U1? Well, it's got the largest tractive effort of all steam locomotives. By the way, one last thing to say about locomotives. I'm not an expert on diesels at all, but tractive effort and power, same rule applies to diesels. You'll be surprised. For example, we saw the Class 08 diesel earlier, same tractive effort as an A4 Pacific, but about a fifth of the power when an A4 was working at a decent level. The Class 37, probably one of the most popular of the earlier diesel designs, the Class 37 has a greater tractive effort than almost all the other contemporary diesels of its time. It was only a British Rail Type 3, so its power rating was a 3, and yet its tractive effort was more than almost all the other diesels of its time. Even higher, for example, than the Deltic. The Deltic's power rating is much higher, over 3,000 horsepower, compared to the 1,700 horsepower of Class 37. But the Class 37's tractive effort was exceptional, which is why it's been such a successful design. Interestingly, in the 1960s on the Western region, they did some trials with running two Class 37s in a pair, and they found that a pair of Class 37s at high speed could run an 8-coach train at about 100 miles an hour. They believe they did clock 100 miles an hour, and they sustained a good high speed, well over 90 miles an hour, for quite a while. But that was two Class 37s. Their power rating, when they're running at 100 miles an hour with an 8-coach train, is probably only about on a par with one A4 Pacific. Their tractive effort was 50% more than an A4 Pacific, but their power rating was barely half as an individual Class 37 locomotive. So there we go, a little bit of information about power and tractive effort. I hope I haven't whittled on for too long. I hope it hasn't been too boring for you. But I just thought it'd be interesting to let people know the difference between the two, and so that next time you're thinking about it or discussing it with someone else, you're a little bit more aware of what we mean by these two terms that are bandied about so often in model railway circles. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed the video. Cheerio for now.